Perhaps, David, I am guilty of saying something similar to this almost every time we begin, but I think people are going to be pretty shocked when they hear what you're going to share with us today. How are you, David?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
And good to be with you. You're going to be discussing some things that you have discovered, links perhaps, between entities that we've spoken about quite a bit throughout the history of the show and some of the previous work that you did. CAI Private Equity, SERCO, Huawei, former Secretary of State and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Alexander Haig, Bill Clinton. It's basically a rogues gallery, isn't it, David?
It's an astonishing rogues gallery that goes back decades. And I marvel at your gift at illuminating these complex theories, with the opening image for this show. And it takes me back historically to my arrival in British Columbia in 1992. And people might find that hard to credit, but I felt that I'd arrived in the most corrupt jurisdiction in the world. And one of the first companies that I came across that seemed to be associated with the work I'd done in artificial intelligence in the 1980s was this company, McDonald Detweiler and Associates, because somehow or other they cozied up to me, and I felt, without really understanding, that they were trying to pick my brains on what I'd succeeded in doing in the 1980s. And then as time went along, I followed McDonald Detweiler very closely, and our listeners may know that I contacted the head of security of the British Royal Navy, Andy Duport, around the period of 2000, about August 2000, indicating or suggesting that the Royal Navy should investigate McDonald Detweiler, because I felt that there appears to have been a private equity takeover at McDonald Detweiler by a group associated with organized crime. Anyway, in his wisdom, he sent me, and I tried twice to put him, put McDonald Detweiler on the map, in particular because they developed a maritime command and information network that I felt could backdoor the United States Navy and potentially put it at threat. Anyway, he replied to my two emails saying, please stop contacting me. We don't know who you are, right? And I don't think he paid attention to what happened subsequently, because the USS Cole seemed to have got a spoofing order or command to go into Aden Harbor to be blown up by docking against one of those bumper subs, rubber tire bumper subs, when in fact Aden Harbor was considered to be very dangerous and controlled by organized crime. So anyway,
well, is it organized crime in Aden Harbor, David? Or, I mean, of course, they told us it was a terrorist event, but this is sort of the crux of what we're talking about today, the difference between those two things.
Yes, and this is newspeak, a la 1984, because what they describe as terrorist events, in my opinion, now we can track back to a criminal insurgency aimed at the destruction of the Five Eyes countries, principally through their signals intelligence network and backdoor. So terrorism covers a multitude of sins, because then that is the Canadians and Americans and Australians and New Zealanders and Brits, we sit back and wait for the next terrorist event instead of trying to identify the communication or the vector movement of criminal assets that would take us back to, allegedly, in my opinion, World War II.
Right.
Where there was this extraordinary process of developing what are called double-cross operations, where an organization like the BBC and an organization like Radio Corporation of America would work together, RCA providing the transmitters that allowed, for example, what they called Aspidistra to broadcast to the German target population during the raids on Berlin that the high command was evacuating the elite, leaving them to fry. And the way they do that, the BBC would wait until the Germans switched their radio transmitters off, right, in order not to be used as homing beacons for the Allied bombing raids. And the very second, maybe even the millisecond, because it's a brilliant bit of engineering, as the Germans stopped broadcasting their radio channels, the BBC would come in with what they called black propaganda. And this played a major role, very hard to measure exactly what, in undermining the morale of the Germans. But you see, the big problem is, after the war is over, what happens to the people who are good at black propaganda and waiting for an opportunity for the enemy's communication system to be blocked and then jumping in with their own vectors, if you will, to get the population moving in the wrong direction? Fast forward to 911. That's exactly, Jason, what happened on 911. During an exercise, right, where there were possibility of switching friend or foe using that Jerome Lemelson patent. Remember, it's one of the patents in the template of 10 patents that I believe are fundamental to the 911 attack. Let me just actually read what it says. This is the prisoner tracking and warning system and corresponding methods, an expert system, algorithms, determining and analyzing deviated behavior, tracks, monitors, and learns behavior, prisoner or parolee, by controlling and regulating permitted, prohibited locations. And the next one is a friend or foe detection system. So what happened
David,
on
let me interrupt you for a second, because this patent, this Jerome Lemelson prisoner tracking and warning system and corresponding methods that you've spoken about for years, I mean, this is essentially what we're all being set up for. We've heard Bill Gates talking about, life's not going to return to normal until we can each have some kind of chip installed in our hands to tell us to tell the public if we've been inoculated or not. And that's going to basically control our access to certain areas. There's already a crude analog version of this happening in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think I mentioned to the viewers, I went to the bank the other day. They wouldn't let me in there. Not only you need a mask, you got to make an appointment on the phone, then they text you. I mean, it's certainly a lot more information about when I'm entering the bank than I used to be required to provide, and they won't let me into the supermarket. The mask is sort of a visual cue, but when there is a digital chip installed in our hands, it's going to be basically exactly this, isn't it?
Well, it's total control, a la Chinese Communist Party, right? Except that the Chinese Communist Party, I allege, is the protege of the British Marxist movement that goes back to the 19th century. Karl Marx worked on the Communist Manifesto, I believe, in the reading room of the British Museum. And there's that wonderful speech by Kennedy of 1961, where he muses on the possibility that the New York Times, if they'd only paid Karl Marx a little more money, he might have been a harmless, scripter for the New York Times, but they didn't pay him enough. So he got really mad and he invented communism in the environment of industrial United Kingdom.
Well, frankly, it's appropriate that it was sort of indirectly born out of the New York Times, given what they're up to nowadays. But it is a remarkable story.
And it's also remarkable that the former Director General of the BBC, I think it's Mark Thompson, is the Chief Executive Officer of the New York Times, right?
Right.
And so let's just go back to that opening image that you have, which I think is important for people to understand where this thread appears to lead.
Now, so David, let me just pause you a second. Before we get into the image, I just want to address some comments that we're having, because a lot of people today are very interested in what's going on with Ghislaine Maxwell. There were some documents that were released, and it's not what we're going to be talking about. We may touch on the influence operations that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell seem to be involved in. I do want to remind people that the documents that were released today are depositions. These are, David, you there?
Yes.
Okay, you blanked out for a second. But David, it's just a release of a transcript of a deposition, and that is testimony from someone. It is not proof of, or I should say, it's just something somebody said. That doesn't mean that the people being accused of these things are innocent, but it doesn't mean that they're guilty. And in our justice system, we must presume that they are innocent until proven guilty. There's some explosive comments in there, but we're really not going to address that today. And I don't want to encourage people in the comments to ask me to ask you things that totally derail from the topic that we're talking about. I get it that people are very curious, but we want to talk specifically today, David, about these things that you've discovered that take us all the way back to this incident from 1989. I remember as a young boy seeing this on television and not really understanding what was going on, but this was this Tiananmen Square incident. Why don't you tell us what we've got in this photo here, David, and that's going to inform people as to what we'll be discussing in just about 45 minutes when we begin the sponsor-exclusive show on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth.
Well, what we're looking at is the precursor, I guess, to the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was a brutal massacre in terms of, and some people talk about tens of thousands of people ultimately not necessarily being killed in Tiananmen Square, but in the aftermath as the Chinese Communist Party rooted out the people associated with the people who were protesting in Tiananmen Square. And there's a man, and no doubt perhaps our listeners will know who he is and what's happened to him. He may well be dead. He may have been rolled over by that tent. But here you see brutalism in the raw, right? This is the Chinese Communist Party ready to kill in very large numbers to preserve the revolution. And remember, there was a question put to Bernardine Dawn, the illustrious professor at Northwestern University. What will you do to protect your revolution? And they eventually said, well, we may have to kill, she and Bill Ayers, we may have to kill 25 million Americans, right? So they're talking big numbers. And of course, anyway, back to that collage. So there we have the image of General Alexander Haig, who 4 months after this massacre, which basically was a war crime on the population, the people of Tiananmen Square, within Tiananmen Square, you have General Alexander Haig, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, attending and was standing on the podium with the Chinese Prime Minister or whatever that dignitary was at that time. I forget his name. And basically, General Alexander Haig, I believe, was saying to the Chinese, no matter, relations with America will continue if I have anything to do with it. And my allegation is he had a great deal to do with what happened subsequently, because this is a founder investor in the CAI Private Equity Group with a number of other people, including Yves Fortier, who's a Rhodes Scholar of 1958, who's a lawyer in Montreal, who I believe coordinated the people who flew up in a chartered plane prior to the assassination of JFK. So back to Haig. So what would Haig be able to do potentially that could threaten perhaps the very existence of the American Republic? Well, with CAI Private Equity Group, he had a number of directors of a company called Nortel, right? And Nortel represented a huge cache of patents and technology in the telecommunications world. It had a dominant position in fiber optics. And of course, if Alexander Haig could transfer technologies from Nortel to a startup company at the time, which was Huawei, then of course Huawei could backdoor through Nortel into the command structure of the Five Eyes countries. Now, Nortel, if one recollects, they span off Entrust, which is a public key infrastructure tool that would allow you access to the Federal Bridge. And the modern Federal Bridge has assets to be deployed in what the RCMP would call a virtual floating matrix that would be very interesting to a criminal insurgency aimed at the destruction of the United States. And that would include the company Boeing.
You know, David, I'm glad you just mentioned Boeing, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but as you're speaking to us about Nortel, and I just brought up this article from Reuters from 2017 talking about the bankruptcy of Nortel, et cetera. It's interesting because, you know, as we look at Boeing and what's happening with it over the past couple years, we can identify a number of things that, were they to be coordinated by individuals with intent, could very well be seen as deliberate catalysts to bankrupt Boeing. You know, we've heard for many, many years about the Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot. These two crashes of the 787 MAX 8, which were, I mean, that represented a huge future potential for Boeing in terms of the increased efficiency of the most popular commercial aircraft ever produced. That thing is basically poisoned now. No airline would want to fly them. No person would want to get on one, really. And we heard a pilot in an interview with ABC News question this MCAS software, saying if there's this type of artificial intelligence software on the plane that pilots don't know about, what else is there? And as you're telling us about Nortel and its bankruptcy, and this concept of corporate raiders from CAI Private Investors Group and Huawei taking over the assets in a bankruptcy, well, I mean, isn't that a great way to buy up a competitor at 10 cents on the dollar?
Absolutely. And I think Nortel had about 6,000 patents. With Entrust, you know, that was floated or spun off, I think they have 150 patents in the areas of public key infrastructure. And McDonnell Detweiler was implementing training programs for Entrust in the 1994-1995 period for Nortel and Cisco. And Cisco is one of the plaintiffs or of victim companies in this action against Huawei in the Brooklyn court. And I think from our listeners' point of view, this should be really encouraging, because you and I are sometimes picked off as conspiracy theorists, or we're anti this, or we're alarmists in this certain area. But there is now an action which merely reinforces what I've been saying at least since 1992 to anyone who cares to listen. And I think perhaps the Royal Navy may be a little reluctant to admit that they didn't know who I was back in 2000. But I think they're going to know who I and you are pretty soon, because I believe Huawei backdoored Nortel into the command and control opportunities for setting up a crime scene on the Federal Bridge of Rhodes. Now, that's a kind of pun, because you can spell Rhodes as R-O-A-D-S. You can also spell Rhodes as R-H-O-D-E-S, i.e. the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme, set up by Cecil Rhodes with a number of law firms, including a very well-known firm called Clifford Chance, the British company, which is now the biggest law firm in the world and has been called upon by Huawei to defend it in certain areas, together with the law firm Sidley Austin. And Clifford Chance helped Cecil Rhodes set up the management of his estate, obviously after his death, and set up the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme. One of the first early benefits, no, not early, a 1968 beneficiary of the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme is the scallywag, that's a wonderful word in English, Bill Clinton. Because in 1968, Bill Clinton went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar to study at the Philosophy, Politics and Economics faculty in Oxford University, which I call the Faculty of Fraud. And here I'm going to be arrogant, and I'm 76, I'm entitled to say what I believe. I believe the people who go through the PPE course at Oxford University, Philosophy, Politics and Economics, come out at the other end scientifically and technically illiterate. And that's a terrifying notion, because many of those people go on to occupy very senior positions in the BBC, which is a master of black propaganda. So every day, if you Google BBC spread of the pandemic, you'll see a daily update from the BBC about the death rates and the infection rates around the world, updated every day, right? Yeah, tracking the global. And if you Google down, you'll find graphics, animated graphics, which shows the BBC is telling the world at large how many people are dying in America, right? And they're creating a virtual floating matrix, if you will, of panic and fear, terror, if you will, but I believe it's more properly associated with a criminal insurgency intended to control our lives than it is by a terrorist group. That is to say, the BBC at the moment is generating black propaganda. You cannot find the truth in any broadcast by the BBC, right? And so just, I don't want to drift off too much, but let's say that Black Lives Matter meme or slogan picked up by the BBC after the death of George Floyd, because someone he knew and didn't like him knelt on his neck, right, for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. And that day or the day after, the Black Lives Matter slogan is out through the BBC to a weekly audience of 500 million people in 50 different languages. So now what they've planted in the collective consciousness of the world is white people are racist and they kill black people because black lives don't matter. Now, I'm saying, going back to that Trump interface, the first companies to be...
Wait, David, you're going like 700 miles an hour, and there's stuff that you said 10 minutes ago that I still want to respond to. So hang on a second.
Okay.
Because we've got comments coming in here. Kimberly Jordan has a very interesting thing to share with us, David. Her father apparently was a, quote, friend of Alexander Haig, and Haig and his wife were at their home in Brussels throughout the early 1970s many times. Alexander Haig always frightened Kimberly terribly. Same with Kissinger. That's interesting. I hope that Kimberly can fill us in on some of that a little bit more. I presume she was a child at the time, and that concept of an adult just being inherently frightening to a child, I think children have a lot of intuition. They're not necessarily encumbered by prejudices or politics or the need to necessarily even be polite. Children sometimes just blurt out whatever, actually always, sort of blurt out whatever is on their mind. So perhaps her instincts about General Haig were spot on.
Well, just on a personal note, I'm blessed because I think I must have a friendly face. I've got funny teeth, but I can look at a kid in a pushchair, right? And they'll look at me, and I'll smile at them because I like kids, and they'll smile. And the mother looks at the kids and then looks at me, puzzled. And that's a gift. It's a blessing, right? And about Alexander Haig, well, he is and should be recognized as a very scary guy. And I believe he's a traitor. Yeah. He betrayed the United States of America. Now,
wait, I have one question for you real quick, David. So Kimberly is talking about visits to her home in Brussels. Now, of course, this might have been at the time. When was Haig the Supreme Allied Commander? And the other question is, how close is Brussels to Luxembourg?
Oh, it's close. Certainly in American terms, American continental, I don't know. It's probably maybe a 3-hour drive for all I know. But yes, I imagine that he was Supreme Allied Commander Europe during that period. Now, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, that would be a position that grew out of Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force that was headquartered in Paris, if I think I've got that right. At the end of World War II, the morphing, if you will, of the Special Operations Executive, which would employ the kind of people I believe the criminal insurgency employs today, morphed into, well, it was disbanded in May of 1946 or 47, I think. But the Special Operations Executive had morphed or mentored the OSS, which turned into the CIA, not the CAI, the CIA. And everyone that I know points out, isn't that interesting that CAI should use the same letters in a different order? And I think it's incredibly important because I think the techniques developed by that private equity group have been inherited from operations of the CIA back to post-World War II. That is to say, Alexander Haig would be very familiar with the techniques of double cross developed during World War II. And the question is, when, if ever, did he stop exploiting those techniques? And I don't think he ever did, right through to his death in 2010. So going very quickly forward with Alexander Haig, like I said, he's in Tiananmen Square, right, 4 months after the massacre. And he's sitting or standing on a podium with the Chinese Prime Minister. I think that's the right position. And he's ensuring that there is no interruption in what most favored trading status or favored trading status with the United States. And the United States intelligence agencies, including, for example, the Marine Corps Intelligence Activity and the CIA and the NSA, they must have been infiltrated, because what was placed in front of their very eyes, very obviously, is that this CAI Private Equity Group is providing military technology to the Communist Party in China that one day would be used against the United States. And I believe...
How did CAI get access to that military technology? Simply due to the fact that people like Alexander Haig were investors in it?
Well, CAI, yes, there are private equity investors. If you have Alexander Haig, the former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, with all his connections, and perhaps more appropriately, his skill set or his knowledge of how to stage a double-cross operation, right? So, unbelievably, on the morning of 9/11, he's being interviewed on Fox News, and he's being asked, as the camera points at the north face of the North Tower with a nice convincing gash, which I believe is being staged by a sort of Hollywood special effects team, he's asked, who does he think is behind it? And he says, I mean, how dumb can you get? Well, I don't want to speculate. I don't have the information. And then he proceeds to speculate. He says, we know where to look. It's either the Palestinians or the bin Laden groups.
Now, David, let me just ask real quickly to make sure that I just understood exactly what you said. You're saying that the impact into the South Tower that leaves that...
North face of the North Tower.
You say is a Hollywood visual effect?
I personally think it is, because, as I understand it, an aluminum hull, I'll give it the American pronunciation, doesn't pierce through a steel frame building from the laws of physics.
Wait a minute. So many people have said that. The laws of physics. I mean, we've seen plastic straws penetrate wooden trees in tornadoes. The question I have never been able to get a physicist to properly answer is this. It's my understanding that force is equal to mass times velocity squared. And therefore, the material that something is made of is immaterial to the amount of force that is generated, except for the mass that it creates. And the mass of an airplane is quite sufficient. The difference in density between aluminum and steel is not as important as the force generated by the moving object. Like if you took a pillow, which is very soft, and just bing, hit it into somebody, no big deal. If Arnold Schwarzenegger wound it up and smacked you in the head with it, that would hurt quite a lot. If we launched a pillow out of a cannon at somebody at 500 miles an hour, the impact would kill them. I personally believe 2 aircraft did impact the World Trade Center on that day. They were not commercial aircraft, as we were told, but I do think, and I wish we could get a scientist to demonstrate this or somehow corroborate this, but I think if you move an aluminum aircraft at 580 miles an hour and it weighs many tons, it's going to generate so much force that it could in fact penetrate concrete and steel due to the massive force.
Let me just answer that. The second law of thermodynamics is a variety of ways of stating it. Is energy is neither lost nor gained in a process, but some energy is always wasted. The energy of a moving object, the kinetic energy of a moving object, is a half mv squared, right? So you're right, it's moving at a high velocity, well, relatively high velocity, but the mass of the plane is then going to hit a building with 200,000 tons of structural steel in it, right? So the potential...
But wait a minute. It's not a block of steel, 200,000 tons. One of the designers of the World Trade Center said that it was specifically designed with a steel lattice to absorb the impact of a jet. It was designed to accommodate a 707, which I think was the most common aircraft at the time. But the designer said, think of it almost as a screen door and a pencil pushing through a screen door. When you think about it in those terms, it's not as simple as a block of 200,000 tons of steel, solid steel being crashed into. I agree that that might be a different circumstance, but we're talking about essentially a hollow lattice being hit at one independent point with a tremendous, tremendous force.
Well, you know what? We're going to get sidetracked into a big technical discussion, but let me just mention that lattice, the capability of that lattice to absorb energy is huge. These are steel girders, right? It's like a flexible, steel is flexible, right? So when you take steel girders and you flex them, you're using an enormous amount of energy. The ability of the steel lattice to absorb energy like a plane is very high, but you see that the girders in some cases have actually been cut. But let's move on, because otherwise we'll spend too much time on this. What I am saying is that if you come back to McDonnell Detweiler in the stages in the run up to 9/11, on May the 3rd of 2001, partly controlled by the CAI Private Equity Group, McDonnell Detweiler makes an announcement. It says it's been awarded a contract by the United States Air Force for instrument approach procedures, right? Where you take a plane off its regular en route airway and move it through and past various obstacles using a drag and drop interface to line it up with what is known as the final approach procedure generated by software in Ottawa through a company called Air Navigation Data. What you're describing there is basically the preamble to the attack of 9/11. Actually, since it was May the 3rd of 2001, it's the preamble to the exercises of Amalgam Virgo on the 1st and 2nd of June of 2001. And if you can pull up the image there, this is an extraordinary exercise because what Canada did, it simulated a hijacking of a plane over Alaska, flew the plane, I think it was a 737, flew the plane south.
Wait, sorry, David. What's the name of the thing again? The
Amalgam Virgo.
Right.
AMALGAM Virgo, of which I believe General Alexander Haig had a major planning role. And it was an exercise to look for the opportunity where the Americans might be tricked into standing down, and they were, right, for 30 hours and hand the airspace above America over to the Canadians. And let me say this, you should not in America assume that Canada is your friend. Many people in Canada love America, but there's a huge body of resentment that I think emanates from various sources like, the late Pierre Trudeau, of resentment against America for whatever you might deem to be its success. And remember, let's go back to Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau visited China in 1973, and he met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, I believe, and he negotiated the first trade agreement between Canada and China, Communist China. And I believe from 1973 onwards, there were elements within the Canadian government that were transferring defense technology, and in particular signals intelligence technology, from Canada into Communist China. Then it was amplified and accelerated after General Alexander Haig's visit 4 months after Tiananmen Square. And then in 1997, Bill Clinton, a Rhodes Scholar who got kicked out of Oxford, having spent a year studying at the Faculty of Fraud, sent General John Shalikashvili to China, to Beijing, to give a talk to the People's Liberation Army. Just actually keep scrolling through on those videos. Keep going, and I'll explain when the particular occur. Keep going more. That you'll find a time scale. I'll tell you when to stop. Keep going. Keep going. There, stop there. Stop there.
The beers.
Yeah, the beers. This is very important because I think this was the preparation through a virtual private network set up with a backdoor through Nortel for the attack of 9/11. So just zoom out a bit so we can see the time scale. This is the exercise of 30th of May 2001 to the 4th of June of 2001. Now look what's happening here. It's really amazing what is going on here. On the Wednesday, you've got CF-18s deployed to Tyndall Air Force Base. That's Canadian Air Force CF-18s.
Uh-huh.
On the Thursday, you got dissimilar air combat training between the Canadian Air Force and F-15 and F-16s of the United States Air Force. And dissimilar air combat training is you've obviously got two planes with different flying characteristics, and this is part of an exercise where you try as the red team, and Canada is playing the red team role, you see if you can get within 3 minutes of target, in which case the red team wins.
Right.
If the blue team can keep the red team away from 3 minutes within target, the blue team wins. So that's a classical exercise that I believe has taken place since 1947, twice a year. So Canada and America are very habituated, if that's the right word, to playing war games where the Canadians play the role of the Russians coming over the pole or whatever. So the problem is, if the Canadian Air Force and Navy and military, for example, have been infiltrated by a criminal insurgency, they could use these kind of games as an opportunity to switch from a friend role in an exercise over to foe role using the Jerome Lemelson pattern.
Right.
Anyway, so now what happens next around 3 o'clock on the Friday afternoon is something truly horrifying, where that is to say, American intelligence agencies have been totally negligent, because what happened then is the skies over America during this exercise, the United States Air Force is stood down. It's jammed, it's blocked, it's obstructed.
And well, as is the Naval Command. You know, you've told us about how the missile defense on the roof of the Pentagon was also stood down. So it's almost like they took over the whole thing.
So you now, for 30 hours, the Canadian Air Force, and within the Canadian Air Force there are traitors, right, I believe. Let's take, for example, this guy, Russell Williams, you know, the murderer.
Oh, yeah.
He was a senior, right? Anyway, I don't want to divert, but
that guy's very interesting, David. There's a lengthy video of him being interrogated and basically RCMP unraveling his lies. He is a psychopath, a murderer, and a traitor, and he was a high-level officer in the Canadian Air Force.
Just like the senior guy in intelligence in the RCMP, Cameron Ortis, is a traitor, right? And was leaking information to the Phantom Secure network that would have enabled them to carry out these kind of operations. But let me go back to that image, because it's vitally important we understand.
I just want to show everybody this Canadian Air Force guy for people who maybe haven't seen all of our shows. He killed women and put on their underwear and photographed himself, and this guy is like a super weirdo. And
filmed himself beating these women, right? Crazy. I mean, there's like little John Benet Ramsey, etc., etc. But anyway, I digress. If you go back to that, the image of the timeline, because it's very important America understand the similarity between the attack of 9/11 and what the BBC and RCA were doing with Project Aspidistra to get the Germans to stand down. But as the bombing raid approaches, the Germans would switch off their broadcasts, and then with the Aspidistra transmitter supplied by RCA, the BBC would jump in and provide the black propaganda, right? And then, of course, at the end of it, they could jump back again. So it returns to German transmission of the radio. On 9/1, no, correction. Let me go back to that May the 1st, 30th of May to the 4th of June exercise. During 30 hours, what the Canadians have done is they've got the Americans to stand down for 30 hours, leaving the Canadians to mount an attack during the exercise, right? And that is intended, I believe, to test out whether that software developed by McDonnell Detweiler could actually take a plane off its regular en route airway, literally electronically hijack it, Jason.
Yeah, and David, just to interject for a moment, we've only got about 10 minutes here before we begin the sponsor exclusive portion of the program. And we did get a question from a viewer basically saying, well, don't you mean that they double-crossed George Bush? Because in the title for today's show, we're asking the question, did an Alexander Haig, Bill Clinton, Huawei cutout double-cross Trump on 9/11? But of course, people, eagle-eyed viewers, will notice that the name Trump is in all caps. And why don't you tell us briefly, David, remind viewers what you mean when you're talking about this Trump interface.
Okay, what Trump is, it's a usability, that's the term that they apply that goes back to the early 80s when I was developing usability concepts for the oil industry. It's a usability facility or software that gives you a dashboard or a template or a cockpit access to the Federal Bridge, such that you can put on a virtual private network for 30 hours and then back out. So basically, if you go back to that image you had, what they did with, what SERCO did with the Israel aircraft industries, they developed an interface that is, Trump interface, that is being used for coronavirus tracking. So that, what you're looking at there, I believe, is a Trump interface that was built for the Israel aircraft industries so they can track coronavirus patients together with various elements like their vital signs. Now, I'm saying this gives you the opportunity for a perfect murder, because remotely you can put in the frequencies and the pressures through the ventilator that would actually kill a target. And at the end of the day, the BBC would announce, oh, well, Boris Johnson, unfortunately, has passed away at St. Thomas's Hospital after being put on a ventilator. And of course, what you've got there is one terrified prime minister,
right,
who went to Oxford, which doesn't do much for his scientific and technological understanding, but I don't want to be unkind, right? But you imagine going into St. Thomas's Hospital with a pretty severe attack of this coronavirus, and they threaten you and say, look, Boris, you keep talking about cutting the BBC's license fees. We don't like that. We like the position of the BBC being the world's leading propaganda arm with a weekly audience of 500 million people that can talk about the spread of the virus without any scientist getting in there and saying, you're talking garbage.
Well, and isn't it interesting, David, that the new policy of the BBC recently announced is that as of August 1st, 2020, people over 75 who previously had a free TV license, it's going to expire, and they're going to start charging them August 2020. This is kind of the exact opposite of what Boris Johnson had been suggesting before he went into St. Thomas's Hospital with coronavirus. He wanted to totally eliminate the BBC license, which for our viewers in the United States, they may not realize there's a mandatory tax on owning a television that any citizen of the United Kingdom must pay, and it goes right to the BBC.
And it generates a huge amount of money. So people like Mark Thompson, former Director General, now the Chief Executive Officer of the New York Times, can generate black propaganda on the pages of the New York Times. That is to say, the media, the international media, is controlled, I think, to a very large extent, by a common feed from the BBC. Right?
Certainly a common group of individuals with a core ideology. I mean, Mark Thompson, we know we've shown this many times, David, and you and I have even been there. Huge controversy in the United Kingdom about this truly appalling sculpture right there on the BBC broadcast house. It essentially depicts an adult man sodomizing a naked young boy, and it was sculpted by yet another bizarre weirdo, Eric Gill, who raped his own daughters, the family dog. I mean, this is just so reprehensible. It's hard to imagine how people can interact with this guy, and he's not a total social pariah. I mean, he's dead
and
now.
Even around the corner, it's even worse because, you have the naked boy Christ being crucified and encouraged to presumably to listen and obey with that book under it. But back to, the role of Alexander Haig.
Wait, sorry, David, I think it is real quick. I think it is important to mention this because we've got a lot of viewers who maybe haven't seen us before, but this is another sculpture on the BBC with the book that says Absculta, instructing people to listen and obey, while they're displaying this, really essentially blasphemous, sexualized imagery of a person who clearly is intended to represent Christ. He's got his hands extended as if he's being crucified, these angels. It's so bizarre.
Yeah, and it's fundamental to the ethos of the BBC, which has many sound and wonderful people. But we're talking about black propaganda from World War II right through to 9/11, where on 9/11, if we just take the North Tower, we have SERCO with its shareholders meeting on the 47th floor. With what kind of technology were they watching the world outside? I believe they were given access to a Trump interface, maybe a big screen, in a room that might be associated with the international insurance agents, that's the wrong word, and looking at the events on the outside world in absolute horror, because what they would have seen, I think, is the track of whatever it was, we can discuss that was heading for the World Trade Center, right, and would hit around the 80th floor.
And isn't it true, David, this Trump usability thing existed long before Donald Trump ever even speculated about becoming president?
Yeah, the name first emerges in the 1990s at the National Physical Laboratory. And I think if you look at the Trump career, there are no coincidences. They called it Trump because then it would confuse people hearing it for the first time that Trump, the man, the two-legged man, right, is synonymous with Trump, the interface into the federal bridge that allows you to set up a virtual private network for a criminal attack, not a terrorist attack, but a criminal attack that will lead the public into believing the original source is, let's say, Osama bin Laden, when in fact it is an attack from within on the very existence of the United States of America, which ultimately failed. Now,
and I know you have a lot more that you want to share with us, David, but we've only got about 3 more minutes here before we transition over to the sponsor exclusive segment on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. So rather than opening up another detailed topic, I think it is valuable to, for our new viewers, people who maybe have forgotten or haven't seen this in a while, let's just remind people what this federal bridge is. Some of these terms are confusing for people who haven't seen them before, but we're looking at sort of a diagram of it here. What can you tell us about this?
Yes, the entities on that diagram you see, including over on the right-hand side, companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. And over on the left-hand side, you have a little group that is made up of the state of Illinois, the Department of Justice, and Veterans Affairs. Well, just think, if you can connect opportunistically, if that's the right word, the entities within the state of Illinois or within Veterans Affairs, and that they have already been converted to the listen and obey, maybe through blackmail, maybe through extortion, maybe through fear, you could literally put together a set of assets as a virtual private network to go through a virtual crime scene and come out the other side and then disband. So leaving no paper trail. So when you come down on the left at around 7 o'clock and you see the the Ministry of Defense in the UK with that CCEB term, that's the Combined Communications Electronics Board, CCEB, that's the same term they used in World War II for those double cross operations. So what this is doing today, it's giving people within the Ministry of Defense and the British government and the Oxford Rhodes Scholars the opportunity to turn on one group of assets and revoke the certificates of other assets. So, for example, on 911, I believe they revoked the certificate of the Boeing company. Remember, its headquarters were now in Chicago, and turned on rogue assets for the 911 attack to be attributed to bin Laden. So what I'm inviting you and our listeners to do is take a look at that indictment that's been unsealed in the Brooklyn court against Huawei, and understand that what Huawei is being accused of is the theft of intellectual property from major American companies and companies with offices in the United States that allowed Huawei to become the world's biggest telecommunications company, and I believe backdoor command and control of the United States of America on 911. And that is to say, because that last attack, that last plane didn't take out the Capitol building, what they've done, the Chinese, in a joint venture with the CAI Private Equity Group and the BBC and SERCO, are actually launching another attack, only this time it's the COVID virus. That is to say, there is a virus out there, but the particular impact that we're being asked to believe in, that is controlling our behavior with the masks and whether or not we can go into a bank, is being orchestrated and articulated and manipulated by the BBC. Right?
Yeah.
So globally, we think that we need to do this to protect ourselves. In fact, it's got, as you very ably said with your guests the other day, that this has got no scientific foundation at all. And if anyone doubts us, they should look at the BBC Contagion ! Which is a documentary that describes a virtual virus that's actually stored on a mobile phone, which of course Huawei make, so that you create an impression, a virtual pandemic that has nothing to do with the real infection. Over to you.
Exactly, David, and it's very well put. I think that it's helpful for people to go over some of these things and to see how they've really come together. You know, the thing that you impressed upon me the most in our conversation leading up to this show last night was this idea that it's almost as if Huawei caught on to what SERCO was doing. I mean, what I observe from speaking to you for several years now is that what we're talking about with SERCO and CAI Private Equity and all these companies is essentially a corporate takeover and infiltration of the governments of the world using technology. And what we're going to talk about when we, in just about less than 10 minutes, when we make our way over to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource-the-truth and subscribestar.com/crowdsource-the-truth, we're going to get into more detail about how it appears that Huawei caught on and wanted in on the action. We'll cover all of that, and I hope we can see everybody over there in just a few minutes, David. I look forward to that sponsor-exclusive segment.
And just very quickly, people may find it easier to understand if they understand that RCA, Radio Corporation of America, worked with the BBC on black propaganda through Aspidistra in World War II, and RCA GB 1929 changed its name at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre to SERCO. And SERCO and the BBC are doing exactly what they did back in World War II, except now they're using a bioweapon, or the perception of a bioweapon, to control society. Listen and obey, folks, but listen very hard. And as Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician, said, we have a moral obligation to think hard. And I don't care whether you've got an IQ of 80 or 280, right? I think it's vitally important people understand what you're being told through the BBC and SERCO and Huawei is not true. It's false, it's a lie, it's invalid. Over to you.
Absolutely. And just real quickly, Aspidistra, because when I initially looked it up, it's some kind of plant or flower. It was the name of a radio transmission tower that was being used to infiltrate German radio broadcasts. So very interesting how that concept, as technology has advanced, has itself gotten much more sophisticated in how it's being done. But it's basically an information infiltration, and we'll be talking more about that when we see everybody over on Subscribestar and Patreon. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you in just a few minutes.
Thank you, Jason.